Paris is silent in the summer of 1940. Not peaceful, silent. German soldiers march past the Arc de Triomphe. French flags disappear from government buildings. The war that was supposed to last years ends in 6 weeks. An armistice is signed in a railway carriage outside Compiegne, in the same place Germany surrendered in 1918. This time France signs. But in kitchens, workshops, and back rooms, a different question begins to form. If the army has fallen, who fights now? On May 10, 1940, Germany attacked France through the Low Countries. The plan was bold and fast. German armored divisions pushed through the Ardennes forest, a region French planners believed was too dense for tanks. They were wrong. Within days, German forces crossed the Meuse River. French defensive lines broke under concentrated air power and rapid armored thrusts. Communication failed. Units were cut off. At Dunkirk, more than 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped across the water to Britain. It was a rescue, not a victory. The British Expeditionary Force survived, but France was left exposed. German forces turned south in early June under what they called Fall Route. Paris was declared an open city on June 13th to avoid destruction. German troops entered the capital the next day. Photographs show them posing beneath the Eiffel Tower, relaxed and confident. The speed of the collapse shocked the world. France had one of the largest armies in Europe. It had fought Germany to a standstill in the First World War. Many believed the Maginot Line would prevent invasion. Instead, the war was decided in weeks. On June 22, 1940, representatives of the French government signed an armistice with Germany in the forest of Compiegne. Adolf Hitler deliberately chose the same railway carriage used for Germany's surrender in 1918. The symbolism was not subtle. The armistice took effect on June 25th. France was divided. The northern and western regions, including Paris and the Atlantic coast, came under direct German military occupation. The southern portion remained nominally independent, governed from the spa town of Vichy. The new government was led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War. Pétain argued that continuing the fight would destroy France completely. He promised order, stability, and protection of French sovereignty, as far as circumstances allowed. Many French citizens accepted this argument. After the trauma of defeat, the promise of stability carried weight. The Vichy government called its new direction the National Revolution. It rejected parts of the French Republic's liberal tradition and promoted conservative, authoritarian values, work, family, and fatherland. Political parties were dissolved. Democratic institutions were suspended. The Third Republic was effectively over. In October 1940, Vichy enacted its own anti-Jewish laws, known as the Statut des Juifs. These measures excluded Jews from public office and certain professions. They were introduced without direct German orders requiring them. Cooperation went further than many had expected. For ordinary civilians, daily life shifted quickly. German troops were visible in cities, curfews were imposed, ration cards governed food purchases. Fuel shortages limited travel, radios were monitored. Listening to foreign broadcasts, especially the BBC, could lead to arrest. Fear worked quietly. The German military administration was efficient. The French police remained in place and continued to function, now under new political realities. Resistance did not erupt immediately. There were no mass uprisings in 1940. Most people focused on survival. Yet even in the summer and autumn of defeat, small acts appeared. Graffiti reading V for Victory began to appear on walls. Posters were torn down. Anti-German leaflets were slipped into mailboxes. Students at the Sorbonne gathered briefly on November 11, 1940, to mark the anniversary of the First World War armistice. German authorities broke up the demonstration and made arrests. These were not coordinated movements. They were signals, fragments of defiance in a country still trying to understand what had happened. The deeper shock was psychological. Some concluded that Germany would win the war entirely. Britain stood alone. The United States was not yet involved. The Soviet Union was still bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany. From a practical perspective, betting against Berlin seemed unrealistic. Accommodation, not rebellion, defined much of 1940. Business owners continued operating, civil servants reported to work, police enforced regulations. Many believed resistance would only bring harsher occupation. The government in Vichy claimed to represent France, yet it operated under the shadow of German power. In that space between occupation and acceptance, something fragile began to form. It did not look like an army. It had no uniforms, no formal chain of command, and no central headquarters. It began with doubt, with refusal, with the quiet decision that cooperation was not the only option. Military defeat came quickly, resistance did not. In the weeks after the armistice, most of France was adjusting to new rules. German military authorities governed the occupied zone from Paris. In the south, the Vichy government insisted it still represented French sovereignty. Publicly, it discouraged defiance. Order, it argued, was now patriotic. Then, from London, a different voice broke through the static. On June 18, 1940, General Charles de Gaulle spoke on the BBC. The broadcast was brief. Few in France heard it live. No recording survives, but its message spread in print and rumor. The war was not over. France had lost a battle, not the war itself. Industrial resources of the British Empire and potentially the United States could still shift the balance. He had been a junior minister in the final days of the Third Republic. Now, from exile, he claimed to speak for a free France. The Vichy government condemned him as a traitor. In 1940 and early 1941, resistance took shape less as armed struggle and more as communication. Words became the first weapons. Small groups began producing underground newspapers. These were not mass publications at first. They were mimeographed sheets, typed and retyped by hand, passed discreetly from person to person. In the occupied zone, publications like Libération Nord and Défense de la France circulated. In the southern zone, movements that would later publish Combat and Libération Sud began organizing. Printing was dangerous. Paper was rationed. Ink had to be acquired quietly. Distribution networks depended on trust. A single informer could unravel months of work. Arrest often meant interrogation by German authorities or by French police acting in cooperation with them. Still, the papers grew. They challenged Vichy propaganda. They criticized collaboration. They reported Allied military developments that German-controlled newspapers minimized or ignored. In a controlled information environment, even small corrections mattered. Listening to the BBC became another act of defiance. Radios had to be registered. German authorities jammed foreign broadcasts. Neighbors could report suspicious behavior. Yet families gathered around receivers late at night, adjusting dials carefully to catch London. Coded phrases, news of bombings, and speeches from exiled leaders carried more than information. They carried proof that Germany had not won everywhere. Intelligence gathering also began quietly. Railway workers observed troop movements. Port employees noted shipping activity. Civil servants copied administrative documents. Information moved through informal networks to intermediaries and eventually to British handlers. At this stage, the resistance was fragmented. There was no single command structure inside France. Gaullists supported de Gaulle's leadership from London. Others resisted without committing to him politically. Monarchists, Republicans, Catholics, Socialists all appeared in different circles. Ideological differences mattered less than the shared rejection of occupation. One major political force remained cautious at first: the French Communist Party. Bound by the August 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact, it did not immediately enter armed resistance after the German invasion. That changed dramatically on June 22, 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Overnight, communist networks shifted into open opposition. Sabotage and targeted attacks began to increase. German authorities responded with repression. Arrests multiplied in 1941. Hostages were taken and executed in retaliation for attacks on German soldiers. Public notices announced shootings in blunt language, listing names and crimes. The message was clear: resistance would carry consequences beyond the individual. The Vichy regime also tightened controls. It censored the press and expanded police powers. In some cases, French police acted directly against underground networks. Cooperation was not always forced. In many instances, it was administrative routine carried into new political circumstances. Underground publications began printing lists of the executed, preserving names that official newspapers would not honor. The resistance of 1940 and 1941 was not yet a guerrilla war. It was a battle over legitimacy and morale. It was fought in print shops, railway offices, classrooms, and kitchens. It depended on secrecy more than firepower. By the end of 1941, something important had shifted. Resistance was no longer just scattered acts of defiance. Networks were forming. Contacts were being made across regions. London was no longer a distant rumor. It was a point of coordination. By 1941, the lines were clearer. Germany controlled the northern and western zones directly. Its military command in Paris oversaw security, economic exploitation, and public order. The Wehrmacht requisitioned food, fuel, and raw materials. French factories produced goods that ultimately supported the German war effort. Occupation was not just military presence, it was systematic extraction. In the south, the government based in Vichy claimed to preserve French independence. Marshal Philippe Pétain remained the symbolic head of state. He was elderly, decorated from the First World War, and presented as a steady hand in chaos. His government promoted what it called the National Revolution, rejecting parliamentary democracy and blaming the Third Republic for morale decline and military weakness. Authoritarian reforms followed. Political parties were dissolved. Trade unions were reorganized under state supervision. Civic freedoms narrowed. A language of renewal masked consolidation of power. Some collaboration was pragmatic. Local officials worked with German authorities to maintain services and avoid harsher controls. Business leaders negotiated contracts. Farmers met production quotas. Survival required interaction. Other collaboration was ideological. Pierre Laval, who would return as head of government in 1942, argued that Germany would dominate Europe and that France should secure a favorable position within that new order. He openly stated that he wished for German victory over Bolshevism. His position was not universal inside Vichy, but it was influential. The regime also moved aggressively against Jews. In October 1940, Vichy introduced the first Statut des Juifs. It defined who was considered Jewish and excluded Jews from public office, the military, education, journalism, and other professions. A second statute in June 1941 tightened restrictions further. These measures were initiated by Vichy officials. They were not simply copied from German decrees. In the occupied zone, German anti-Jewish policy escalated in parallel. Registration, property confiscation, and forced identification intensified. By 1942, deportations began in large numbers. On July 16 and 17, 1942, French police carried out a mass roundup in Paris known as Veldiv arrest. More than 13,000 Jewish men, women, and children were detained and held in the Velodrome des Verts before being transferred to transit camps and then deported east. German authorities directed the policy. French police executed the operation. This was a turning point. It demonstrated that collaboration could extend to active participation in persecution. At the same time, daily life under occupation hardened. Rationing grew stricter. Meat, butter, and fuel were scarce. Long lines formed outside shops. Black markets flourished. Travel between zones required permits. Mail was censored. Public gatherings were monitored. The German security apparatus expanded. The Gestapo operated in major cities. Informants were recruited. Arrests were often based on intercepted mail, denunciations, or infiltration. In many cases, French police cooperated directly in surveillance and detention. Resistance networks felt the pressure. Underground presses were raided. Couriers were tracked. Intelligence channels were disrupted. Some groups dissolved under arrest. Others adapted by compartmentalizing operations, limiting knowledge within cells to reduce damage if captured. Meanwhile, events outside France reshaped the internal balance. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The French Communist Party moved immediately to active resistance. Sabotage increased. German soldiers were attacked in public. These actions triggered brutal reprisals. Hostages were executed in retaliation for assassinations. Public notices listed the names of the dead to deter further attacks. The cycle was deliberate. German authorities believed collective punishment would isolate resistance from the broader population. Sometimes it worked. Families feared association. In other cases, reprisals deepened resentment. In November 1942, the strategic situation shifted again. After Allied forces landed in North Africa, Germany launched what it called Operation Anton and occupied the southern zone of France. The line dividing occupied and unoccupied territory disappeared. Vichy remained in place, but its autonomy narrowed further. For many who had accepted Vichy as a shield against full occupation, that illusion weakened. By the end of 1942, France was fully under German military control. Collaboration was no longer theoretical. It had administrative structure, legal framework, and police enforcement. Anti-Jewish measures had escalated into deportations. Repression had intensified. Resistance remained fragmented, but it was no longer marginal. Armed attacks, intelligence work, underground publications, and escape networks had expanded. The occupation was not temporary, it was entrenched. The policies were not symbolic, they carried consequences measured in arrests, deportations, and executions. By 1942, resistance in France was no longer just scattered defiance, it was becoming organized. Different movements had grown in isolation. Some were rooted in conservative Catholic circles. Others were socialist or communist. Some supported General de Gaulle in London. Others distrusted him. All opposed German occupation. They did not agree on what France should look like after liberation. Coordination was difficult. Travel was restricted. Communication was dangerous. Infiltration was common. Trust had to be earned carefully and often through intermediaries. Into this environment stepped a former prefect from southern France, Jean Moulin. In late 1941, Moulin made contact with de Gaulle in London. He returned to France in January 1942 with a clear mission: unify the major resistance movements under a single political umbrella that recognized de Gaulle's authority. It was an ambitious task. Moulin moved cautiously, meeting leaders from groups such as Kanba, Liberation Sud, and Front Tireur. Each organization had its own networks, funding sources, and priorities. Some were focused on intelligence, others emphasized propaganda. A few had begun limited sabotage operations. In May 1943, Moulin helped establish Council National de Resistance, known as the CNR. It brought together representatives of resistance movements, political parties, and trade unions. For the first time, there was a central coordinating body linking internal resistance with the Free French leadership in London. At the same time, external support increased. The British government's Special Operations Executive expanded its activities in France. SOE agents parachuted in to train fighters, organize supply drops, and coordinate sabotage. Weapons, radios, and explosives were delivered by night flights over rural areas. American involvement followed through the Office of Strategic Services, though British networks remained dominant early on. Foreign support strengthened resistance capability, but it also introduced friction. Some French leaders resented outside influence. Others feared that independent armed groups could act recklessly and provoke severe reprisals. Sabotage operations grew more frequent in 1942 and early 1943. Railway lines were damaged, industrial equipment was destroyed, power stations were targeted. The goal was not open battle, it was disruption. German authorities responded with expanded counterintelligence. The Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst intensified surveillance. Informers were planted, radio transmissions were triangulated. Entire networks were sometimes rolled up in a single coordinated arrest. The risk was constant. Couriers carried messages by bicycle or train, often memorized rather than written. Safe houses changed frequently. False identity papers were produced in improvised workshops. One development dramatically expanded resistance ranks: the Service du Travail Obligatoire, or STO. In February 1943, Vichy agreed to send French workers to Germany for compulsory labor. Young men faced the prospect of being transported to work in German factories supporting the war effort. Many chose instead to disappear into rural areas. These draft evaders formed the core of what became known as the Maquis. The term originally referred to the scrubland terrain where they hid. It soon became shorthand for rural guerrilla bands. The Maquis were not professional soldiers. They were students, farmers, factory workers, and clerks. Weapons were scarce, training was limited, but numbers increased rapidly in 1943 as the STO expanded. Rural communities sometimes supported them with food and shelter. In other cases, villagers feared German retaliation and kept their distance. Not all resistance was disciplined. There were instances of theft, poorly planned attacks, and internal disputes. German reprisals could be devastating. Entire villages faced punishment for suspected cooperation with guerrillas. The movement remained vulnerable at the top. On June 21, 1943, Jean Moulin was arrested in Caulier near Lyon during a meeting of resistance leaders. The circumstances remained debated, but the result was clear. He was transferred to German custody and tortured by Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo in Lyon. Moulin died during transfer to Germany in July 1943. His death was a severe blow. He had been the central bridge between London and the internal movements. Yet the structures he helped create survived him. The CNR continued operating. Coordination did not collapse. By late 1943, resistance inside France had changed in scale and character. It was still fragmented. Ideological differences had not vanished. Communist groups often maintained parallel armed units. Gaullist-aligned movements emphasized coordination with London. Regional leaders operated with significant autonomy. But the idea of a unified national resistance was no longer symbolic. It had committees, supply lines, and communication channels. It had armed groups in forests and urban cells in cities. Germany still controlled France militarily. Vichy still functioned administratively. Arrests and executions continued. Yet the occupation no longer faced isolated acts of defiance. It faced a network. By 1943, resistance in France had moved beyond pamphlets and secret meetings. It now had fighters in the field. The word Maquis originally described the thick brush and rugged terrain of southern France. It became the name for rural guerrilla bands hiding in forests, mountains, and isolated farmland. Most of the men who joined them were not trained soldiers. They were young French citizens avoiding the service du travail obligatoire. When Vichy agreed to send workers to Germany for forced labor, thousands chose flight over compliance. At first, the Maquis were loosely organized. Small groups gathered in remote areas where German patrols were less frequent. Regions like the massive Central and the Vercors Plateau and parts of the Limousin and Auvergne became known as strongholds. Terrain mattered. Narrow roads and forest cover provided concealment, but concealment was not the same as strength. Weapons were scarce in 1943. Many Maquis units had only a handful of rifles. Ammunition was limited. Some weapons were leftovers from 1940. Others were captured or purchased on the black market. Airdrops from Britain increased supply, but distribution was uneven and sometimes delayed by weather or miscommunication. Training was minimal. Most recruits had no combat experience. Leadership varied in quality. Some groups were disciplined and cautious, others were impulsive. Rail lines were sabotaged more frequently. Bridges were damaged. Telephone and telegraph lines were cut. German vehicles were ambushed on rural roads. These actions did not stop German control of France, but they forced occupation forces to divert troops into security operations. German doctrine treated partisan activity as a military threat. Anti-partisan sweeps intensified in 1943. Units conducted raids on suspected Maquis areas, often using collective punishment. If a village was believed to be supplying guerrillas, arrests followed. Hostages were taken. In some cases, houses were burned. Rural civilians faced real consequences for even minor assistance. Providing food, shelter, or information could result in imprisonment or deportation. Yet support networks expanded. Farmers supplied bread and milk. Doctors treated wounded fighters discreetly. School teachers passed messages. Clergy sometimes sheltered fugitives. This civilian web sustained the Maquis. Without it, they would not have survived. As coordination improved under the umbrella of the Conseil National de Résistance, armed units were gradually linked into a broader structure. By early 1944, many Maquis groups were integrated into what became known as the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, or FFI. This designation aimed to standardize command and align guerrilla activity with Allied strategy. It did not erase local autonomy. Many regional leaders retained significant independence, but it provided a framework for coordination. One region that symbolized both ambition and vulnerability was the Vercors Plateau. Resistance leaders in Vercors envisioned the plateau as a potential base for large-scale operations in support of an Allied landing. Its elevated terrain and limited access points seemed defensible. By mid-1944, thousands of fighters gathered there, preparing for a possible coordinated uprising. The strategy was risky. German forces monitored resistance activity closely. When Allied landings in Normandy began in June 1944, Maquis units across France intensified sabotage. Railway disruptions increased sharply. Communication lines were cut at a scale not previously seen. In Vercors, resistance fighters declared the area a free republic in early July 1944. The declaration was symbolic. It signaled open defiance. German forces responded decisively. Airborne troops and ground units attacked the plateau later that month. Resistance fighters, lightly armed and lacking heavy support, were overwhelmed. Casualties were high. Civilians were executed. The Vercors operation ended in defeat. The lesson was harsh. Guerrilla forces could disrupt and harass. Holding territory against concentrated German units was far more difficult. Elsewhere, Maquis groups adapted by returning to mobility. Instead of attempting to defend static positions, they focused on ambush, sabotage, and rapid dispersal. Hit-and-run tactics proved more sustainable. By early 1944, estimates of resistance strength varied widely. Definitions differed. Active fighters, support networks, sympathizers. But what had once been dozens of isolated cells had grown into tens of thousands of participants across France. Their military capability remained limited compared to regular armies. They lacked artillery, armored vehicles, and air support. They depended heavily on Allied supplies and coordination, yet their strategic value lay in disruption. German divisions in France had to allocate troops to guard railways, depots, and communication hubs. Trains ran slower and with heavier security. Bridges required patrols. Every blown track section demanded repair crews and protection. The Maquis did not defeat German forces directly, they strained them. For civilians who had watched occupation settle into routine, the visible presence of armed French fighters signaled that collaboration was not universal. It showed that resistance was not confined to hidden print shops or secret meetings. It carried rifles. That visibility inspired some and alarmed others. Families feared retaliation. Communities weighed risk against pride. The Maquis were imperfect. Discipline was inconsistent. Ideological divisions persisted. But by 1944, they represented a new phase of the struggle. By late 1943, resistance inside France was no longer operating blindly. It was tied into a wider war plan. Allied leaders preparing for the invasion of Western Europe needed information, precise, current, and local. German troop movements, rail capacity, fuel depots, radar stations, coastal defenses. Much of that intelligence came from inside occupied France. Railway workers counted trains and noted cargo types. Civil servants copied transport orders. Dock workers observed ship arrivals and departures. Farmers living near airfields reported aircraft activity. This information moved through layered networks, often by hand, sometimes by clandestine radio, eventually reaching London. A mistaken report could redirect bombing raids or distort planning. Resistance networks learned to verify before transmitting. Coordination intensified in early 1944 as Allied invasion planning entered its final phase. The operation that would land Allied forces in Normandy, Operation Overlord, depended on slowing German reinforcements once the landings began. French resistance could not stop German divisions outright, but they could delay them. Sabotage planning became systematic. Railway infrastructure was the primary target. France's rail system was dense and essential for rapid troop movement. Destroying entire lines was impractical, but damaging specific nodes, switching yards, signal boxes, bridges, could create cascading delays. The British Special Operations Executive and Allied planners developed coordinated sabotage programs. One was known as the Plan Vert, focused on rail disruption. Others targeted telecommunications and fuel depots. Instructions were delivered through coded broadcasts on the BBC. Seemingly poetic or trivial phases signaled activation. Among the most famous lines were from Paul Verlaine's poem Chantons d'Atomes. The first line warned resistance groups that invasion was imminent. The second line indicated that action should begin within hours. These broadcasts were monitored by German intelligence as well, but distinguishing signal from noise in coded language was difficult. On the night of June 5th and 6, 1944, resistance networks across France acted. Rail lines were cut in hundreds of locations, bridges were damaged, telephone cables were severed, electrical substations were attacked. In some areas, entire sections of track were rendered unusable within hours. The effect was not total paralysis. German forces still moved. Repairs began quickly, but disruption slowed coordination. Trains were delayed or rerouted. Units arriving at rail junctions encountered confusion and backlog. Communications faltered at critical moments. Allied after-action analysis later concluded that sabotage significantly complicated German response during the first days after the Normandy landings. It did not prevent reinforcement entirely, but it bought time. Resistance also supplied direct battlefield intelligence. Reports on German defensive positions, minefields, and unit strength were transmitted ahead of the landings. In some regions, local guides assisted Allied paratroopers who had landed off target. Sabotage was not limited to infrastructure. Factories producing war material experienced accidents. Machinery malfunctioned. Production quotas slipped. Some breakdowns were subtle and difficult to trace. Others were overt explosions. Industrial disruption forced German authorities to divert additional security personnel. Repression intensified in parallel. German counterintelligence units tracked radio transmissions using direction-finding equipment. Mobile detection vans triangulated signals from clandestine transmitters. Operators were trained to send short, timed bursts to reduce risk. Even so, many were captured. Captured resistance members faced interrogation under torture. Some networks collaborated entirely after a single compromised contact. Compartmentalization helped limit damage, but infiltration remained a constant threat. German authorities also launched large-scale sweeps in areas suspected of heavy resistance activity. Suspected collaborators were arrested. Hostages were taken in response to sabotage. Public execution notices continued to appear in cities. The escalation created a grim balance. Each act of sabotage risked civilian reprisal. Yet in 1944, restraint carried its own cost. The invasion window was narrow. Weather, tides, and operational secrecy limited opportunity. Resistance leaders understood that inaction would squander their strategic moment. Coordination between London and internal resistance was not perfect. Communication delays and regional differences in readiness produced uneven results. Some areas acted more aggressively than others. In places where weapons had been sufficiently supplied by airdrops, sabotage was extensive. In other regions, capability lagged. German divisions stationed in France had already been weakened by transfers to the Eastern Front and Italy. Those remaining had to guard coastlines, cities, depots, and rail hubs. After June 6, they faced simultaneous external assault and internal disruption. Resistance fighters did not storm beaches at Normandy. They did not possess tanks or aircraft. Their contribution was indirect but measurable. By June 1944, the resistance had evolved from scattered protest into coordinated auxiliary force. It remained lightly armed compared to regular armies. It remained vulnerable to arrest and execution. But it was no longer operating in isolation. The war had returned to French soil, and the networks built in secrecy were now acting in open coordination with the largest amphibious invasion in history. German authorities never treated France as a quiet occupation. From the beginning, security forces monitored dissent. By 1943, with sabotage expanding and Maquis groups growing in number, repression became systematic and often brutal. The German security apparatus inside France was layered. The Wehrmacht maintained military control. The Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst handled intelligence and political policing. Specialized anti-partisan units conducted sweeps in rural areas. French police, in many cases, cooperated in arrests and surveillance. Interrogation methods were harsh. Suspected resistance members were beaten, deprived of sleep, and subjected to torture. Information extracted under duress sometimes led to entire networks being dismantled in days. Safe houses were compromised, radio operators were captured, couriers disappeared. Arrests did not always lead to prison in France. Many detainees were deported to concentration camps in Germany or occupied Eastern Europe. Others were executed locally as hostages. The hostage policy was deliberate. After attacks on German soldiers, occupation authorities often announced that a fixed number of prisoners would be shot in reprisal. Public posters listed names and ages. The aim was deterrence. Families reading those notices understood that resistance could cost not only individual lives, but collective punishment. In rural areas, anti-partisan operations intensified. German doctrine treated guerrilla activity as a military threat requiring overwhelming response. Villages suspecting of sheltering Maquis units faced raids. Houses were searched, livestock was seized, men were rounded up for questioning. In some cases, entire communities were punished. One of the most notorious examples occurred on June 10, 1944, in the village of Oranier-sur-Glane. Units from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, entered the village. Men were separated from women and children. The men were shot in groups inside barns and garages. Women and children were confined in the church, where an explosive device was detonated before the building was set on fire. In total, 642 civilians were killed. Oradour was not a battlefield engagement. It was not a spontaneous reaction to an immediate firefight inside the village. It was part of a broader pattern of terror operations aimed at discouraging resistance as Allied forces advanced through Normandy. The destruction of Oradour sent a message. Entire communities could be erased. Such massacres were not daily occurrences, but they were not isolated either. In other regions, executions followed sabotage incidents. Bodies were left displayed as warnings. Civilians were deported for suspected assistance to Maquis fighters. Sabotage was strategically valuable, especially after the Allied landings, but every operation risked reprisal. Blowing a railway line could result in hostages shot the next morning. Ambushing a convoy could trigger village searches. There was no formula to balance action and consequence. Some leaders chose caution in heavily populated areas. Others prioritized military necessity, believing that shortening the war would ultimately save more lives. Urban repression also intensified in 1944. In cities like Lyon and Paris, security forces conducted targeted arrests of suspected organizers. Torture centers operated in confiscated buildings. Informers remained a constant threat. The collaborationist militia known as the Milés, established by Vichy in 1943, became increasingly active in pursuing resistance members. Unlike German units, the Milés consisted of French citizens. Its members were often ideologically committed to the Vichy regime and hostile to both communists and Gaullists. Their involvement deepened internal division and post-war bitterness. Despite repression, resistance did not collapse. Network structures had been built with compartmentalization in mind. Members often knew only a few contacts. If one cell was compromised, others might survive. Communication methods evolved to reduce exposure. Meetings were shorter, locations shifted more frequently. Resistance fighters lived with the knowledge that capture could mean torture or deportation. Civilians who offered shelter understood the risk extended to their families, yet participation continued. The violence of 1943 and 1944 did not silence resistance. It clarified the stakes. Occupation was no longer defined only by ration cards and curfews. It was defined by deportation trains, execution lists, and burned villages. For some, this hardened resolve. For others, it reinforced caution. By mid-1944, France stood in a narrow corridor between two advancing forces, Allied armies from the west and German security operations from within. Resistance fighters operated inside that corridor, exposed to both opportunity and danger. The cost of action was visible. The cost of inaction was becoming harder to accept. Repression had been designed to isolate resistance from the broader population. Instead, in many regions, it made the conflict impossible to ignore. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, France did not erupt all at once. Resistance networks had been preparing for months. Sabotage plans were in place. Arms drops had increased. Command structures had been aligned under the Forces Françaises de l'Entour, the FFI. But even with preparation, the moment of open uprising required calculation. In the days after D-Day, Maquis units intensified attacks on railways, bridges, and communication lines. German troop movements toward Normandy were slowed by repeated disruptions. Repair crews worked constantly. Security detachments were pulled from other duties to guard infrastructure. In some regions, resistance groups moved from sabotage to direct engagement. Ambushes on convoys increased. Checkpoints were attacked. Isolated German garrisons were harassed. Fighters who had hidden in forests were now visible on roads. German response was uneven. In areas close to active front lines, forces were redeployed toward Normandy. In other regions, especially central and southern France, anti-partisan sweeps continued with force. Resistance fighters faced the risk of being caught between advancing Allies and retreating German units. Coordination with Allied command was improving but imperfect. Radio contact existed, but operational decisions on the ground often depended on local judgment. Some resistance leaders chose patience, waiting for Allied troops to approach before rising openly. Others initiated uprisings earlier, hoping to seize control before German withdrawal. One city where timing became critical was Paris. By August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing rapidly. German control of Paris was weakening but not yet gone. Resistance groups inside the city debated whether to act immediately or wait for Allied arrival. On August 19, 1944, a general strike began. Police headquarters were seized by resistance forces. Barricades appeared in streets. Fighting broke out between German troops and FFI units. Trams were overturned to block intersections. Sandbags were piled behind doorways. The uprising was not a spontaneous riot. It had organization behind it, but it was also driven by urgency. Resistance leaders feared that if they waited too long, political control of the city would fall entirely into Allied hands without visible French participation. German commander General Dietrich von Choltitz received orders from Berlin to destroy key infrastructure if Paris could not be held. Bridges across the Seine were wired for demolition. Government buildings were prepared for sabotage. Whether von Choltitz ever seriously intended to carry out total destruction remains debated. What is clear is that widespread demolition did not occur. As fighting intensified, resistance units held key buildings but lacked heavy weapons. German artillery and armored vehicles could still dominate open areas. Casualties mounted. Allied High Command had not initially prioritized a rapid entry into Paris. The city required supply resources that were scarce, and military planners focused on encircling German forces west of the capital. But the scale of the uprising changed calculations. French General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, attached to U.S. forces, was ordered toward Paris. On August 24th, advance elements entered the city. The following day, German forces surrendered. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets. Flags reappeared from hidden storage. Church bells rang. Resistance fighters emerged from concealment wearing armbands marked FFI. For many civilians, the occupation ended in celebration. Yet liberation was not uniform across France. In some towns, German units withdrew with minimal fighting. In others, clashes were sharp and destructive. Resistance groups in southwestern and central regions assisted Allied forces by seizing key roads and bridges ahead of advancing armies. In Brittany and the Loire Valley, cooperation between FFI units and regular Allied divisions accelerated German retreat. In areas like Vercors, the earlier attempt to hold territory had failed under concentrated German assault. The lesson was applied elsewhere. Mobility and coordination were more sustainable than static defense. As liberation progressed, political questions resurfaced. General de Gaulle returned to France and moved quickly to assert authority. He aimed to ensure that France would be recognized as a liberated nation rather than an occupied territory administered by the Allies. The presence of organized internal resistance strengthened that claim. On August 26, de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées in Paris amid cheering crowds. The resistance had not defeated German occupation alone. Allied armies had provided the decisive military force, but resistance activity had shaped conditions inside the country. It had disrupted infrastructure, provided intelligence, and maintained a visible French role in the struggle. Open fighting in cities carried risks. Casualties among resistance fighters and civilians were real. Some German units fought stubbornly during retreat. Snipers and isolated pockets of resistance to liberation prolonged violence in certain districts. By September 1944, most of France was under Allied and Free French control. German forces retreated toward the east. Organized resistance transitioned into integration with regular military structures or disbanded. For 4 years, resistance had operated in shadows, printing, listening, sabotaging, hiding. Now it stood in daylight, armed and recognized. The occupation had ended. The reckoning had not yet begun. As German forces retreated and Allied troops advanced, France faced an internal question that could not be postponed: what to do with collaborators. In some places, the response was immediate and uncontrolled. This period became known as the Épuration Sauvage, the Wild Purge. Suspected collaborators were arrested, beaten, or executed without formal trial. Women accused of relationships with German soldiers were publicly humiliated. Their heads were shaved in town squares. Crowds gathered to watch. Estimates of summary executions vary. Historians generally place the number in the thousands, often cited between 6,000 and 10,000 nationwide. Record-keeping was inconsistent, and some killings were concealed or misattributed. The violence reflected anger accumulated over 4 years of occupation. It also reflected uncertainty. In the absence of fully restored legal authority, local resistance groups sometimes acted as judges. General Charles de Gaulle moved quickly to re-establish centralized control. He understood that uncontrolled reprisals could undermine France's claim to stability and legitimacy. Provisional courts were created to conduct formal trials of collaboration. This second phase, Opération Légale, sought to channel retribution through legal processes. Thousands were investigated. Many were barred from public office. Some were imprisoned. A small number received death sentences. Among the most prominent figures tried were Marshal Philippe Pétain and Pierre Laval. Pétain was convicted of treason in 1945 and sentenced to death. A sentence later commuted to life imprisonment due to his age and service in the First World War. Laval was executed in October 1945. The trial signaled a break with Vichy's legitimacy. The narrative that emerged emphasized resistance as the true face of France. In reality, active resistance involved a minority of the population. Participation expanded dramatically in 1944, especially as German defeat became likely. Earlier in the occupation, many citizens had chosen accommodation, caution, or silence. Some had cooperated willingly, others had complied under pressure. After liberation, collective memory shifted. Public commemorations highlighted unity. The story of France as a nation that had resisted from the beginning became dominant in political discourse. This narrative served multiple purposes. It strengthened national cohesion. It reduced internal division. It positioned France as a partner among victorious Allied powers. The complexities of collaboration and passivity were not erased, but they were often softened in public presentation. The resistance itself was not monolithic after liberation. Communist groups, whose armed units had grown significantly after 1941, emerged with increased political influence. They had paid a heavy price in arrests and executions. Gaullist supporters sought to ensure that the state would not fracture into competing factions. Balancing these forces required negotiation. The Conseil National de Resistance had drafted a program outlining post-war reforms, including social security measures, nationalization of certain industries, and expanded labor rights. Some of these proposals were implemented in the late 1940s, shaping modern French social policy. Yet memory continued to evolve. In the decades following the war, historians re-examined archives and testimonies. Greater attention was given to Vichy's independent role in anti-Jewish legislation. The scale of French police involvement in deportations became clearer. The myth of near-universal resistance faced scrutiny. Recognition expanded to include groups sometimes marginalized in early narratives: foreign fighters within the resistance, colonial soldiers, Jewish resistance networks, and women who served as couriers, intelligence agents, and organizers. The resistance had always been diverse. Post-war memory gradually acknowledged that diversity. What remains certain is this: between 1940 and 1944, resistance in France moved through phases: shock, organization, fragmentation, unification, escalation, and open uprising. It never represented the entire nation. It never possessed the strength of a conventional army. It depended on Allied military force for final victory. But it altered the shape of occupation. It preserved lines of communication with the outside world. It complicated German administration. It delayed reinforcements at a critical moment. It provided a political foundation for re-establishing French sovereignty. The reckoning after liberation was imperfect and sometimes violent. Justice was uneven. Memory was selective. Yet the question that began quietly in 1940, "Who fights now?" had been answered by thousands who chose risk over resignation. The war ended in Europe in May 1945. France emerged battered but sovereign. Its internal conflict did not vanish overnight, but its status as an occupied state did. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with doubt, with a radio turned low at night, with ink on paper that could cost a life. From 1940 to 1944, the French resistance was never a single army. It was students and railway workers, farmers and factory hands, Gaullists, communists, Catholics, skeptics. Some fought with rifles in forests, others fought with information and silence. They did not defeat Nazi Germany alone. Allied armies carried the weight of conventional war, but resistance shaped the ground beneath that war. It delayed trains, it exposed lies, it refused legitimacy to occupation. When liberation came, France did not rise from nothing. It rose from networks built in shadow. Occupation demanded obedience. Resistance answered with persistence. And that persistence ensured that defeat in 1940 was not the end of the story. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.